Hello and welcome to the 21st Century Work-Life podcast, where we talk about how the world of work and our attitudes to work are changing. This show is brought to you by Virtual Not Distant, a London-based company where we help teams and organizations transition to an office-optional approach. To have a look at what we do and the show notes to our podcast episodes, head over to virtualnotdistant.com. Thank you for spending your time with us. Hello and welcome to episode 215 of the 21st Century Work-Life podcast. And in today's episode, we're going to look back at 2019, what has happened in the remote space. And by we, I don't just mean Maya Middlemiss and myself, Pilar. Good to meet you if we haven't met before. But also guest Rowena Henningham, who also gives us her view of how she's seen the remote space in 2019 and of how it's looking and how she's hoping it's going to look in 2020. So remember that you can follow the conversation and check out the links over in the show notes, mainly over at virtualnotdistant.com. And this is episode 215. Or also, we've got a reduced version of the show notes in your podcast app by tapping on the episode or looking at details. I'm going to keep this intro very short as this episode is really long. What's new? Maya and I recorded most of it, but we had so much to say that it ran over the recording slot and I had to abruptly leave the recording to hop onto a call. So we were going to finish recording the following day, but Maya got a cold and we decided that, we'd covered most of the stuff. But she didn't get to wish you a happy 2020, so I'm doing that in her name. Have a great start to 2020. One other thing we had planned was to give you an update on what Virtual Not Distant will be up to in the new year. We've got some plans that I really want to share with you, but I'm going to do that in a separate, shorter episode, which will either be released the day after this one goes out or the week after. Yeah, I'll also share some listener feedback or other thoughts, not necessarily feedback as such, but other thoughts from listeners of the show. So I'll be back at the end of the episode to say goodbye. But for now, let's look back at 2019. Are you ready to take on what is going to be another mammoth episode?
Whoa, well, yes, what a year it's been to look back on.
Yes, lots of stuff happening. So we thought we'd start with just a very general introduction overview of what's going on. We'll have a look at some of what's happening in the remote world advocacy space. And then we'll have a little bit of a chat about tech and how the developments around tech are affecting how we're working. We're going to touch on loneliness. Let's start. I'd be interested to hear what you think has been like the biggest thing that you think back in 2019 and go, it was that, Maya. But for me, it's been that I've noticed that the services, courses, advocacy, conferences around remote work have exploded and become very visible. And sometimes I don't know whether it's just my LinkedIn and Twitter threads because of the people I'm connected to, but I've heard this before from other people also, that it's really exploded. There's lots of stuff. It's something that when we started, which wasn't that long ago, Virtual Not Distant is only, I don't even know, I think it's 4 years old. Well, we've been doing the podcast for 4 years old. And I really wasn't seeing this coming. I couldn't see this. I have to say that a lot of the stuff is international stuff. A lot of stuff's coming from the US, not much still in the UK. So I wasn't expecting that. This year it's really exploded. But in contrast to that, I think that the real world is stuck in the 90s version of home working. So I've got some stuff I want to refer after I hear what have your thoughts been, Maya.
Well, yes, I agree with you that this has been a year where there's been a lot more explosion of visibility and noise around remote work. And obviously, I do think we are in a bit of a bubble in terms of our feeds and what interests us and what we look for to listen out for. But just the general discourse around work, I think there has been a lot more talk about remote work. But as you say, for those people who've been working and operating in the space for a long time versus organizations in particular that are coming new to it, there's still a big disconnect and some catching up to do.
I got an email from someone at livebeyond.global. His name is Felipe, and he actually got in touch through my personal website after seeing a post celebrating the 5 years of podcasting. What he does, I'll just read out the email I asked him, and this is just to illustrate, like, it's not just about people, it's about services and businesses and people supporting remote workers. So he says improving performance in a remote work has to go hand in hand with self-management, since the environment they are immersed in is not one of externally imposed structure and cadence. It all needs to be self-generated, and for that, the mind plays a big part. It requires the development of habits, rituals, and routines that will allow remote workers to strengthen the mind and be able to be fully present when at work. This is big for us. And then he explained that they organize 2 to 4 week experiences in remote locations aimed at location-independent workers to learn and practice new habits, etc., etc. So check that out if that is of interest to you listening. Livebeyond.global. I haven't had any experience. I haven't met Felipe. This is like the only contact that I've had with him. But I thought, well, he's written, he explained what it was, and I thought I'd share that as an example of the kind of stuff. Rebel and Connect, for example, still do retreats for remote teams. Again, they've been around for a little bit longer. So I just thought it's really interesting illustration of that.
Yeah, and very interesting, the kind of personal qualities that they're focusing on of being able to self-manage and self-motivate and to concentrate on work. An interesting tie-in with our recent episode about artificial intelligence and the kind of roles that automation is going to replace and what's going to be left for the humans and what kind of qualities we'll need to cultivate. And I can see a lot of parallels there.
Yeah, excellent. I came across a white paper by Nuffield Health, which we'll touch on later, I think, because that we can get a lot from that. But in a nutshell, and I've emailed them back straight away to ask why this was. It's really good. It's UK-based paper. It's a study of lots of research that's taken place over the past years. It's very current, and it looks at especially. I like that it highlighted mental health, etc. Something I really liked also, it puts the whole conversation in perspective, because what we as advocates hear a lot and push out a lot is all the benefits in increasing job satisfaction, etc. But for example, here in this paper, which is mainly about people going remote in organizations, they said that, 68% of employees were, I don't know, the highest bits of I'm really satisfied with my job. But 67% of those who weren't working remotely also were very satisfied with their work. So I really like that balance that they gave us.
Just the existence of that research is kind of another manifestation of the normalizing and mainstreaming of the debate that we mentioned in the introduction. So, that's all good.
And they mentioned the self-employed in this paper also, but it really was mainly about people working and mainly home working, people working a few days from home, or as they said, having their home as their base. So maybe they also used other places, but actually having that. So that's another thing, is that the definition of remote work, of home working even, still is a little bit woolly and different people interpret it differently.
Yeah.
So we're seeing more adoption, etc. And then I came across an article from Strategy and Business. And I hope that in the new year, we'll hear from Art, the editor, who I talked to at the end of this year, but I haven't published the interview yet. But this is an article called Inflexible Work Arrangements, and it's from November the 6th, 2019. And okay, so this is really interesting. They said, okay, this is US. Bureau of Labor Statistics has done a study. So the people taking part in this were only wage and salary workers, and this focused on their main job. So they left out self-employed, freelancers, and people who have like side hustles. And this is the bit that I thought this is going to get in the way, as well as something else that I want to mention. They said when it comes to telecommuting, so people working remotely for organizations, the figures were particularly disappointing. 1 in 4 people said they have worked from home at least occasionally. Okay, fine, whatever. If we want that to be an option, great, 1 in 4. But that figure includes people doing additional work at home outside of their work hours, some of which they're not paid for. Only 15% of respondents, instead of 25, said there were entire days on which they worked from home. And I thought, yeah, that's really good for advocating.
Yeah. Oh, that's really depressing, actually. It's the fact that it suggests that a lot of people's first experience of working outside of the office is catching up on stuff they're not getting paid for.
On top of that, we haven't published the episode yet, but listeners will have heard that. And you've been working on the show notes for episode 214, Maya. So I don't know if you remember that Eva Rimbau Gilabert, who was talking about how remote is seen and adopted in Spain, she was saying that a lot of employees already do a lot of their communication through technology, like WhatsApp groups and stuff like that.
And they're expected to do it 24/7 as well.
Yes, and there's also that expectation. And it got me thinking, well, if technology is already in the workplace and it's actually, in my eyes, a lot of the time hindering our co-located experience, so it's getting in the way, it's adding noise, it's adding hours maybe, and we already, when we're together in the office, experiencing that because it's just been integrated anyway. That's really bad for making the case for going remote, because if I'm a person whose main, similar to what you were saying just now, whose main experience of communicating through technology is that added on thing that I have to do in the office also, this added on thing that I'm now doing outside work hours, why on earth would I want to give remote work a try? Why on earth would I want to give my colleagues the space? So why on earth, if I'm a manager, do I think that's going to make my team better and not worse? So
it's certainly not a remote first mindset, is it, at all? Even that word, I mean, we were just talking about language, but telecommuting, this whole sense that you're kind of dialing into a center because you're stuck out somewhere and it's not quite as good. I hate that word.
It does belong to a different era. So if people are having these bad experiences already communicating, because I don't understand why there's so much online communication in co-located spaces, to be honest.
Well, that's just the way we're going, isn't it? You would understand if you had teenage daughters like I do. That's how we do things now.
But I think that needs to be addressed, because the whole thing about sending an email to someone who's on the floor, top floor, instead of getting up and going, all of that. But that gets in the way of then adopting online practices when we need them. So all of that this year has thrown up. However, I did find that an article in Personnel Today from actually the 30th of September, which again UK based, which says that remote working roles have doubled in 4 years. And I thought that was well, I think that this article actually says, okay, we are getting more. And actually, this article says that the salaries of remote workers are actually above the office-based. This comes from CV Library, which is a job board, a UK-based job board. And it says roles in education, including assessors and special educational needs officers, offered an average salary of £69,000 for remote work, compared with £31,000 for office-based. I mean, that disparity is huge.
That is massive, isn't it? And there obviously must be other factors confounding that as a thing. I mean, like the Nuffield research that we were talking about showed that it tends to be senior roles and people more senior in their careers that either request or get offered home working. So I'm sure there's some confounding in there.
Yeah. So it's a good headline. I completely, I agree. It does make me wonder, okay, what else? There is also my first fear is, oh my God, remote means 24 hours a day.
Well, there's that too, yeah.
So anyway, worth looking at, listeners. So yes, and at the same time, I still think that it's being seen as working from home. Oh, one other thing that I thought was really interesting, and actually it's been a hunch, and actually something that Chris Slemp mentioned on this show probably a couple of years ago when he first talked about office optional. And it's that, and I hear this a lot, that a lot of companies are saying, oh, we want to offer remote and flexible work because millennials expect it. And my thing has always been, well, I don't know. I mean, I don't know how old millennials are now. They're probably already in their 30s. So then they would be right. But there's always this assumption that the younger generations want this more. And Chris, a couple of years ago, said, well, actually, when we went office optional, it was the younger employees that didn't like it as much. 35% of 30 to 45-year-olds want the ability to work remotely, compared with 23% of employees in their 20s, many of whom favor the ability to socialize at work. So that's 35% of older ones versus 23%. And I think this is really important to remember.
Yeah, and you do wonder whether it's researchers and policymakers who still see millennials as some kind of breed apart with special technological and sociological needs, and don't realize that we're now talking about a generation well into their 30s who are assuming very diverse roles throughout the workplace. And there's much less of a hard edge between the whole idea of digital natives and digital immigrants is really, it's more about how people adopt and use technology in their lives. And it doesn't matter what year you were born in.
So there's all of that. I think, well, of course, in this podcast, we advocate for an office optional approach. We are trying to understand also what's happening outside our bubble. And so we welcome any more numbers, especially recent stuff. The great thing, as you were saying, Maya, before, is all this data is now coming out. And this is really, really important that we understand what we are assuming, what we're interpreting, and what is near the truth. Of course, all these numbers, we always need to see where they're coming from, who's behind them, etc. However, it's really important that we have that. But it's also important that we hear from the advocates of the space. So I just want to refer back to Nomad City, which is the conference in Gran Canaria, which featured in one of our episodes, unusually. Episode 210 is a Thoughtful Thursday episode all about that conference. So you're welcome to listen to that. However, I wasn't able to make it, but Maya, you were.
I was, and it was a really wonderful event. I'm so glad I got the opportunity to go.
So tell us about it then. Tell us, I suppose, what were anything that surprised you, or anything that was really salient during the conference for you, or just your impressions and just tell us about it.
Sure. Well, I suppose one of the most exciting things for me, having worked on this podcast for the last couple of years, was to actually put names to voices. And some of the people who've joined us regularly, like Marcus Vermuth and Laurel Farah and people like that, actually the podcast came to life on stage, which was amazing. But it was actually great to be around so many people who think and feel about remote work the way we do, and are actually not only passionately advocating for it, but advocating for quality and good practice. And just to have all those people in one place was really exciting and energizing, because we're all remote and we're all from all over the world. So that idea of coming together, we do it on the podcast in sort of groups of 1 and 2. But it was great to get everybody together in the space. Because of the branding of Nomad City, I must admit, going back to our recent comments about millennials and digital natives, I was slightly concerned that, am I going to be the only person over 40 in the room? Are they all going to be sort of digital nomads who are all developers and all, just going from one cool location to another to do amazing things? And actually, there was great diversity in the room. And yes, there were 20-something software developers who spend their time in lots of co-workings and co-living spaces. And Tenerife and Gran Canaria are both branding themselves as locations for that. And it's fantastic because they've got the beach, they've got the broadband. Why not? If you are sort of footloose millennial digital nomad, I would totally go and hang out there. But there are lots of other people too in different organizations, often some big global brands, through to freelancers working on their own. And it was just a really interesting crowd of really nice people, all with this common aim of wanting to make remote work more of an accessible thing for the whole world. So yeah, it was a really, really interesting few days.
So content-wise, what was salient for you, or anything that you hadn't thought about before?
I mean, they were very much diverse presentations, and Nacho and his colleagues had done a great job of putting together a program that reflected a lot of current debates, but some strong themes that emerged. One was about remote work noise and notifications and asynchronous communication, which is something we talk about a lot here. We are not the only ones who are struggling to find the right path through all the different apps and tools that are available to us, and how we manage our attention in the remote space as it grows and explodes, and how we can get the work done and at the same time communicate effectively. And I think we're seeing different tech responding to that in different ways. It's something that different organizations are responding to in different ways, policy-wise. And a lot of those things are happening very much out in the open, the way organizations like Buffer, for example, work very transparently and put their stuff out there. This is what we're experimenting with. And we've had Marcus on this show before talking about that. And I think it'll be a really interesting thing to watch as more and more large organizations and large teams move towards remote as we move into the next year. So that was a very strong theme. The idea of remote for social change, remote for kind of resilience of organizations and individuals was a very interesting one as well. I think the idea that around the world people are using remote work to try and rebuild communities and rebuild areas as a response to issues of either climate change or urban development, and what remote work can bring, even to a place like Gran Canaria, bringing all these advocates together for a few days, and what that means to an island community. So that was another very strong theme. For me, it felt like quite a sophistication of the debate, that people were really drilling down into the nuances. And there were sessions and tracks about finding remote work and getting started in remote and, hiring your first person and so on. But there were some quite higher level debates about things like how to onboard people effectively, how to integrate people into your remote working culture, how to define the culture you want and then build and nurture behaviors around that. And it really made me feel that the debate was becoming very mature and really very interesting. It almost wasn't about remote work. That was taken for granted because of the audience and the environment. So we were able to talk about the details of remote work in a way that I hadn't really experienced before.
Good. Well, I am delighted to say that we have another voice in today's episode, and this is Rowena Hennigan. So I will introduce her in the segment with her, because I haven't recorded the segment yet as we speak. But listeners, have a listen. Well, this is a first, having somebody on the last annual episode, on our annual episode on reflection. So thank you very much, Rowena Henningham, for being here all the way from Zaragoza.
It's almost the afternoon here, so buenas tardes. Yes, I'm live from Zaragoza, which I often have to explain to people where it is, even though it is the 5th biggest city in Spain, but it seems to be a little bit unknown to people.
And where is it? Remind me.
Well, in terms of train journeys and talking about the fast train, the AVE, it's equidistant between Barcelona and Madrid, and also it's quite near the Pyrenees. So it's one of the reasons we love being here. We're quite near the mountains, about an hour and a half from the mountains. So it's a fantastic place to live.
Very nice. So you, one of the reasons why I thought it'd be interesting to come on this particular show is that you delivered a keynote on social impact and sustainability at Nomad City.
So I made contact through LinkedIn and through my networking with Nacho, who I know has been on the podcast before, and we started talking about me possibly being involved in Nomad City. And I spend most of my time as a remote worker actually teaching remotely and lecturing remotely to a university in Dublin. So that's a bit of a novelty. I don't think there's that many of us that are totally remote with academic institutions. as part of that, as part of talking about possible education and skills related to remote work, during a long call with Nacho, we got onto the topic of social impact and sustainability, which is one of my passion topics, an area I'm really interested in. And he invited me to speak, and I did that with the commitment of, because I'm an industry academic, I agreed to it with the plan in my head that I would conduct some exploratory interviews and talk to some people that I had identified within the remote working community that seemed to be making great progress in these areas or represented different areas within positive social impact and sustainability. So I conducted 12 exploratory interviews, and that was part of what led to the full keynote speech, which I delivered in Gran Canaria and Las Palmas. And for me, it was a labor of love to start with. But the main thing that came out of it for me was the amount of interest and support in the remote work community. I think because we're extending our thoughts and discussions on the benefits of remote work, there's lots more information, there's lots more research and discussions happening around the extended benefits, the socioeconomic benefits, the environmental benefits, etc., of remote working. And therefore, those interviews fed into the keynote, and it enabled a really positive response from the audience there. And also, as part of that, I've developed a couple of blog posts, and there's more information available online. But what's happened is some positive action now. So I'm talking to Nacho as a result of the keynote, and looking at ways and how we can build on some of those observations and areas of interest for the next Nomad City. And more importantly, we've agreed to look at sustainability as a key issue and look at some concrete actions that we can undertake. And I'm working with him on that. And the key area there is the measurement of sustainability in relation to the event. So we're investigating how we can measure the different activities that the event undertakes and how we can balance out those activities. And that's in discussion now, and we're talking to a couple of experts as well on that. So it's great to have that in progress and have a little team in place. And also there's been some other good collaborations coming out of the different interviews that I held. And then there's some other developments that are happening. For example, Raul Rivera, who is the American veteran, who I spoke to on diversity and inclusion. I had a call with him yesterday, actually, and talking to him about how we can work together on looking at some training programs for veterans in the US and how they develop their training for veterans who are moving out of the military and possibly looking at transitioning into remote work. So it's fantastic to have made these connections and of course to go and do the keynote, but I'm really keen to progress the activities and the collaborations, Pilar, so that we've got some positive outcomes out of the keynote as well.
You're going to be measuring the impact of the conference itself in some way, is that right?
So we're looking at sustainability measurements specifically. So one of the things that was interesting was that part of me delivering virtually to my university that I work with in Dublin is that I often look at what I'm saving carbon emissions wise by not travelling to Dublin, and I can use a carbon calculator to check those and the emission savings. When I agreed to go to Gran Canaria, I cancelled my carbon emissions using a third-party carbon emissions cancelling site called Mossy Earth. And there's lots of new ways to measure how our carbon footprint and carbon emissions is one of the main ways of measurement. So what we've said is, rather than just print a charter, for example, Pilar, on the Nomad City site, what we're going to do is look at it if we can actually measure with some experts what the carbon footprint is already for the event. This is in the early stages now. And then if we have that baseline, we can improve on it as the event goes forward. We can look at then those more clear actions that might support that. So promoting that to the attendees, then looking at other possible things. I mean, Nomad City is well on. Nacho is passionate already on this. That's why he invited me to speak. But we had cloth bags for reuse. We had metal bottles that we could refill. I mean, there's always improvements, but they're very aware already, in my opinion. And with that awareness, we can build on it and get some measurement in place.
And also, I think it's a really good role modeling for any kind of advocacy, not just for remote work, obviously, but for anything else. But for remote work in particular, I think we are at the point now, and this is something that I've started to see this year, is where we are starting to get more data. We're starting to get wider sets of data, more up-to-date sets of data, not just, of course, on sustainability, but actually on the impact of remote work on the individual, on organizations and society. So I think this is really good role modeling of saying we are going to see what the impact of this particular thing is, and we're going to see how we sustain it. And these are the kind of messages that come from us having gathered that data. So that's, really celebrate that.
Exactly. And then share that framework as part of the next conference as well. I mean, obviously, any framework, any measurement, there's going to be limitations, there might be critique. But I mean, the whole area of carbon emission cancelling is there could be people listening who want to sit me down and have a big discussion with me about it. There's some controversial elements to it. But part of my keynote was the awareness, Pilar, for example, of how we tread on the earth, how, what we're doing that matters, and what doesn't matter, what's positive, what is negative. And I think that's the level of discussion that we start off. And if we can measure it, even if that measurement framework is not 100% ideal, we have to start somewhere and have a benchmark. And people who work in research and academia like myself, we would be keen to have that benchmark. So that's what's in discussion now. And I had various approaches from members of the remote work community after the keynote who wanted to talk about and share their examples of how they advocate for the environmental benefits or the little things that they do in their day-to-day remote working lives. And we've just seen more and more sharing of that. I've seen it on LinkedIn, simple ideas, examples, and all of that feeds into. Because one of the key messages, it can be a bit overwhelming, and it's like anything that's going on in the world with relation to the climate crisis and all that. It can be overwhelming because people don't know where to start. So one of the key things that I try to get across to the audience, and I believe I was successful, is that the small things matter. The little things that everyone can do every day can matter, and acknowledging those that you're doing that. And then obviously at a team level, at a corporate level, etc. We need to come from the ground up as well as from the top down, which is happening through policy.
Good. So, as well as that, which is something, of course, that from my point of view actually has been something that struck me this year. What other stuff has been going on in your mind? What other thoughts have you got for this last year around this whole remote work space that has exploded?
It's been really interesting. I think the conversations have shifted to another level. And I wrote a list of a few of the different things I've noticed. But the first thing I wanted to share was the awareness in education that's happening, because I'm coming from a university perspective. And myself and a couple of colleagues in Dublin have launched the first undergrad in remote skills in Ireland. And it's at a level 8. And I've been teaching that virtually from Zaragoza to Dublin with a group of human resource undergrads, and it's been fascinating to get those undergrads' feedback. They're very lucky to have the opportunity to study what remote work is about and have me deliver virtually. In my opinion, I would have loved it as an undergrad student. And we're using continuous assessment that's quite innovative, getting them to record their own online meetings, Pilar, and also the assessment, a lot of it is online, and it's quite innovative. But what was really interesting to me is that with all that information to these 20 and 21-year-olds, a portion of them, about a quarter of them, said that they didn't believe remote work would suit their personality. Okay? Mm-hmm. And I think that's a huge progression, that we're getting to the stage that the message is spreading and the awareness is spreading, and that we're getting over this kind of frenzy and hype that was happening maybe 2017, 2018. And it's a more realistic conversation. It's more around, because people are really getting, like in this module of teaching, they're getting a proper view on it, and they're saying, well, I don't know if that would suit my personality. reality. So I thought that was really interesting, that self-awareness and bringing that in. But on the flip side of that, these undergrads also said to me, but we really need to know about it, because if we work in HR, we could have remote workers on our team. We might adopt a remote first strategy in a company, etc., etc. So that for me was a shift, and I think there's more and more of that happening both in the private and public sector of education, and there's more honest conversations happening. And I've seen it as well in some of the discussions online, where people are actually just able to say, I wouldn't like it full time. I'd rather go into an office, or say, I need to go to a co-working space. So I think that quality of the discussion has shifted. So that's one of the things that I've noticed. So I don't know if you've got any comment on that.
Yeah, I agree. I agree that the conversations have really matured, which I really, really welcome. I think they're going deeper, they're going broader. And like you say, and we're going to really see what the issues are. And we're starting to really accept, I think that's the most important thing, that this is, for me, remote work is not the future, it's part of the future.
Yes.
And so I really like, I like that. Very interesting that you said that.
Yeah, well, that anecdote really made me check back in as well with my ethos, because I'm in the camp of I've remote worked since 2007. I'm an advocate, so I think it really made check myself, and exactly what you said, Pilar, that it's part of the future. It's not the panacea. It's not everything in nirvana, and that we need that balanced view. The other thing that's been interesting for me is the remote first. So when I look at case studies for my work and for my content and academic research, a lot of the industry examples and case studies will be coming from 100% remote companies, the leaders that we all know the names of, right? But what's happening slowly is there's other companies, and HubSpot is a good example of it, who are transitioning. And they've got a division of remote workers. And Megan Williams from there was very, very kindly let me interview her and gave me her time for the keynote. And she's got a dedicated position at HubSpot. They're looking at a podcast. They've put in a specific team to support their division of 300 remote workers. So I think the hybrid, these newer models, these transitioning models, there's better examples coming out of there as well. And there's lessons learned. And I think that's really important, Pilar, as well, to call that one out specifically, because I think we get more honesty from them, because don't get me wrong, I'm sure there's lots of failed examples of 100% remote companies, but I think that the biggest part of the chunk of the market going forward is these companies that will be transitioning. And I think the more open information, discussion, case studies, debates that are happening there will be something that'll be really positive going forward.
Well, I would like to invite any listeners who are in companies where remote workers are still people who work maybe away from the office, 60% of the time, or companies that still have very strong presence in headquarters, and some people are working away, because actually that's what I'm seeing are the largest part of the population that's adopting remote work are not 100% distributed companies, but are more traditional setups that are incorporating it. And we're missing a lot of their experiences because they're not out there advocating for it, because they don't have online products that they can also support with their experiences.
But I'll tell you another anecdote, and it's coming from the young students I've been teaching virtually as well. I asked them on every session that I did remotely, I asked them, do you know any remote workers? And they would feed back on chat, because some of them had gone away to ask around family and friends, okay? So it was so that they could have a concrete example in their network. And on the last session, a couple of weeks ago, one of them said she was actually sitting in a computer lab in the university in Dublin. She said, one of my friends is sitting beside me and he's remote working at the moment.
Nice.
And he was working for a major tech company on customer service. Okay. And he said, tell your lecturer that they've helped put me through uni. I'm doing 20 hours a week on contract with them in customer service. So I think also that sharing that awareness, it's all building and it all feeds in. But I think the last thing I want to say, and it kind of ties those two things together, that we've got better conversations, better information, all of that is, I think now we need to move, and this is tying back into the start, of the conversation, Pilar, into better frameworks, measurement models, and organizing that information, observations. Even the terminology we're using within the industry is quite diverse, and I'd love to see a shift into 2020. That would be my wish from 2019, where we see some consolidation in that as well. And I think the potential is maybe there now, because even the quality of the industry reports, the ones that we may all know from different leaders, from Zapier, from some the global analytics in America, etc., etc. I've seen an improvement even in some of the way the data has been presented, their measurements, and I'd love to see that consolidate again, and we have some better frameworks and information out there for people as well. So that would be my wish, because I guess from my perspective to share that with you is because I'm organizing content for undergrad and postgrads, and it's when you look for that academic, and a lot of it's in industry content as well, and you're organizing it into information that's going to be digested in a webinar on a learning management system, you really notice how the different terminology, how there isn't that much there on frameworks. And I mean, we can borrow from existing management and leadership theory, but I'd love to see some developments in that area as well, and that we've got some better research and models to reference.
Excellent. More evidence-based stuff would be
exactly.
great.
Exactly.
Yeah, and I'm glad you've noticed the shift. And as always, Rowena, when I've got people and listeners, when I have people on the podcast, they made me think. Something you said that I've never thought about. You said about your student who had a fellow student next to them working remotely for a company, and they were being able to go to college because of that.
Yes.
Student jobs. This is something I hadn't thought of, and it's that the nature of student jobs can really change, and students can, instead of having to take the job that is available to them as close as possible, and that's the most convenient, they can actually now maybe start to look for part-time junior positions in companies that are actually related to what they're studying, without worrying about the fact that they're not there.
Exactly. And what's really interesting is they're the transferable skills that they may need. What's interesting is if they look at the remote skills that they might need for something like a customer service job with a tech company, learning those systems, whether it be an online tool, video conferencing, whatever, it's fantastic work-based competencies. And it's something that they can do easily without commuting.
And the online communication skills, they're very different, communicating online with your friends to communicating at work. So that's, again, another skill that can be learned, that will be useful. So anything else you want to say to listeners, seeing as you're here, before we wish you a great 2020?
No, I think that's more than enough to share. I just the same as you. If there's any of those companies in transitions or listeners from companies like that want to share their stories, it's fantastic for me and for my colleagues at TU Dublin, because we're looking for the case studies and the good, the bad, and the ugly, in terms of helping other companies transition and realise the benefits.
Great. So that's the advocate space. Did you meet her, Rowena?
Rowena was lovely. Yes, I met Rowena and her mum, who had never heard her daughter speak before. So she came along as a guest to the conference and was able to understand in more depth what was so important about her daughter's work. So it was lovely talking to them both.
Excellent. Good. So let's move on then onto another side of remote work, and it's, of course, the tech. Again, I don't know if it's because I'm much more receptive and I'm in this space, but it really feels like the tech has exploded, not just in the number of applications, because now, honestly, there's so many new tools for all kinds of, for meetings, for collaboration, for whatever. There's just lots of stuff. Plus, the people who are already in this space have been have been developing and changing and evolving. So I thought that was really something I saw this year.
Yeah, I think it's been a huge trend. And as you know, I also write for Unified Communications today. So a lot of these things come across my desk as new releases. But it's been the way, again, it was like with the conference. We might have had a few years ago a conference about what remote work is, but now we're drilling down into the details. And it's the same with the tech, that these platforms and tools are now really differentiating and niching down. And you're getting different things emerging for different kinds of businesses, different kinds of teams, different kinds of priorities in a way that just wasn't there a year or two ago.
And also how these companies understand that it's not just remote workers who are working online. It's back to the point we were making earlier, that so the adoption is also, they also want those people to adopt to use the tools. And I think that that's quite interesting, because then it means that they're not just developing for remote, but also for co-located. And I wonder whether there's, just thinking about it now, I wonder whether there's something around that I'm picking up on. I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know. I think it's something that it feels like it's all at a bit of an inflection point, because at the same time as there are millions of new tools, they're all kind of eating each other's space as well, because they're all starting to do everything that all the others do. There's a sense that something's got to kind of settle down a little bit, I think, soon.
Yeah. So Trello celebrated the 50 million users this year.
Wow.
Congratulations, Trello. That's amazing. That's amazing. And I think that again, of course, many people use Trello who are not working remotely. I recently, you remember the workshop we did on last week where someone said that their wife used it to plan the holidays and stuff.
I'm using it to plan a house purchase at the moment.
Wow. That's also something, I suppose, that has obviously not this year, and it's been something that actually has started since we started using Word. That we used for our own stuff and also for work. But also this crossover now, not just of, this crossover of tools that we use at work that we also use in our personal lives. And I wonder what that is doing to our, to our sense of work-life separation, if we need it.
Yeah, I suppose it depends whether you're somebody who regards yourself as having work-life separation.
Yes.
Maybe it's different for people with proper jobs and so on. For me, it's all just one big blurred up blend. And why wouldn't I use the tools that I know help me project manage things in my work life? It just seemed logical to put all the house viewings into a Trello.
Because one of the things, I mean, we'll come to the health thing in a second, but this whole thing about some remote work, especially those in organizations, finding it difficult to switch off from work because the tech is there in your home. And also sometimes I'll go in to do something in Trello that maybe is related to writing or whatever, or even a to-do, and I see a notification from a work-related board. And I think there's also something around that.
Yes, and then maybe Trello will respond and give us more granular control over those notifications soon, because it would be nice to be able to, like you can with Slack, to have different workplaces. All right, say I want to silence that one and I want loads of alerts from that one or whatever, and have a little bit more control over it.
That's a good feature request.
Are you listening, Trello?
So that's been one. The other thing around the tech that I've been thinking a lot about is how, as these tools develop and we get excited about the features they offer. This is something I thought first when Matt Ballantyne was on the show. I think that was also this year. This year has been a great one for guests also.
Yes.
It really, really made me think very deeply about stuff because we decided to go into this main area of remote work and online collaboration. I think that we managed to go a bit deeper. And is this thing that who is designing the tools and what are the tools we use doing to our workflow and the way in which we work. And I was running a workshop on just last week also in the UK for a management team, and they are switching to a new platform. It's a sales platform, so something to do with phones and stuff, but it's also got some collaboration features in it. And they were very aware. Someone right at the end of the session said, we have to make sure the tools don't drive how we work. And I said, well, good luck with that.
Yes.
No, but what I did say is there is not one tool that is going to be perfect for you at the moment. I mean, we all know that all is. However, you've got to be very aware of the limitations of the tool, of how much you can adapt to it, and just be aware of what it could do to how you're working. Because I don't think we're going to be able to find yet the tool that helps us to work exactly in the way we want to.
Obviously, you have to choose the right tool in the first place that's the closest to the way you want to do things, and then look at how much you can adapt it to be your servant. But it's the same as if you move into a new office building, you've got to deal with where the walls are and the toilets and the plugs and everything. There's only a certain amount you can change. To another extent, you have to adapt to what's there.
Exactly. So that balance between adapting and just letting all these new features and stuff just run how you just rule how you run, rule how you work. And another thing that's been worrying me, and this is, I don't know. I do like Office 365 as an all-inclusive solution for having everything in one place, but what they're doing is driving me crazy. And the last thing I saw they did, so Microsoft Teams has always been a bit like Skype, that is just a team space. So you have meetings, pretty much like you have in Zoom, not the webinar Zoom, the meeting Zoom. But now they've introduced presenter mode into it, which means, well, one is good because then if you want to run webinars there, because at one point I was asked to run a webinar on Microsoft Teams and it wasn't the right platform. However, in doing that, we're already going back to, are we going back to putting stuff that we used to in the older workspace, which is when we have a meeting, we must have a presentation, and therefore I'm going to be the presenter and you're going to be in one mode and I'm going to be in another.
Yeah.
And again, so I think my worry is that some of these features are familiar because it's what we're used to, and they might just get us to revert back to a way which we're more comfortable with, but which is not necessarily better for us.
Yes, it does feel very much like trying to replicate not just the physical workspace, but quite traditional hierarchical structures. And this is how you run a meeting. This is how information flows within a team. And that really we could better serve ourselves by stepping back and thinking, what do we need in this new workspace of the future?
So there's always, I mean, I had some great conversations this year over Twitter with Justin Morris, whose job was to introduce Microsoft Teams in organizations. And for every feature that I went, he always said, yeah, Pilar, but remember that there is this group and there is this thing. And so there's always something. Yeah. So I suppose all I'm saying, listeners, is just to be aware of this and just to be aware of the features, the new features, what they are suggesting that we add to our way of working. So just that awareness, I think. But really, again, because the space has exploded this year, then these things are coming up. So I suppose it's just the space moving and all these things are coming up.
It is. And the space is fragmenting and differentiating. It just because something is available doesn't mean everyone's going to adopt it or use it. And it doesn't mean that everyone's going to use every feature that's there as well.
On top of this, because of the technology and stuff, I am seeing, maybe I've already seen this, which is one is this use of remote when we mean hybrid. So when we're talking about remote workers, actually what we mean is some people, but mainly we are co-located in the space and there's some remote. So we're having a remote meeting that actually means hybrid meeting. And I'm having recently run a hybrid workshop with you, Maya, for a client. I'm in such a dilemma at the moment whether this, whether we in the space, we should be taking a stance against, like hybrid workshops and stuff like that. Or actually we're just waiting for the tech to get a little bit better.
Yeah, I think we have to wait for the tech to improve and work with where we're at in terms of the transition, I think. I mean, all the research we were looking at earlier says that remote is still the outlier. It's still the unusual. And the only way we're going to drive it's just going to be hybrid for a long time yet, I guess.
Okay. So I suppose then I'm really glad to say that I went, so I'm based in London, and the other day I went to Farringdon to see, I can't remember the name of his company, but lovely John Knight. He showed me some rooms they have with some new technology, and this is Nureva, Nureva. So it's a room designed for hybrid interactions. So instead of having like a little speaker or the speaker from, or a speaker that basically stays in one place, they've got a sound bar. It's kind of a sound bar with 8 microphones, which means the room is not very big, but it does mean that wherever you are in the room, your sound is probably going to get picked up quite well. The other thing it had was a webcam, and you could change it so that it was in panning feature, in zooming feature. And what that did is it followed people. So if, say, you're doing a workshop and as facilitator, you're moving around the room, or you have an exercise where people need to move around, the camera will say, oh, there's a person there. I will follow and zoom in.
Brilliant. That's really respecting the remote gaze. And really putting the remote person not sort of stuck on a wall wondering what's going on.
Yes.
Putting them at the center of the conversation. I really like those features. I know that Cisco WebEx is doing something similar with their cognitive collaboration tools, and they're actually, when people in the hybrid room are talking, it will now tag the speaker so the remote person knows who is speaking. With voice recognition, it will label them.
And of course, we have the owl, or meeting owl from Owl Labs, that is also designed to pick up and who is speaking, and giving that person some spotlight for the people who are looking at them on a screen, who are online.
It's nice. It means the remote person's sort of in the middle of the room rather than off in a corner.
This is the thing, that the Nureva room was set up like that. It had wonderful lighting. You could see the display, so where the remote people would be, you could see them very well, even if the whole room was lit up. Whereas in the traditional space, which is one of the reasons why I've gone off slides, is that if you have a projection or a screen or something, the lights need to be down for you to see. So it's that balance of, can we see the remotes well on the screen, or can they see us well in the room? So yes, a lot of, for us in the space, a lot of dilemmas, and just sorting out and really balancing pros and cons in every single situation. I think from the point of view of organizations, these rooms that John was showing me, I think he said for £30,000 you could have all that tech, plus including 3, not whiteboards, but interactive boards and everything. And for large organizations, that is nothing. So absolutely. Maybe companies hopefully will start, those that know that they can benefit from remote people can start to incorporate that into their office designs and really think of, okay, who is going to be using this room? And not just, we've got booths where it's quite quiet for you to chat to your remote colleagues, or, you've got that screen there so you can see them. Well,
we can do better than that as we go into 2020.
Yes, excellent. So that's our thing. And finally, of course, I didn't catch this on time when it happened, but a few days later I did see that Office 365 had gone down for some time. All this stuff about visible teamwork, visible workflow, working in the cloud, and I thought, what are we doing suggesting all of this? So there is also that.
We do depend on it all actually working, don't we? And even simpler than that, yesterday, where I live and work from at home in Spain, we had terrible weather yesterday and the power kept going off. So my complete dependency on all these online cloud-based tools, I was suddenly forcibly reminded of the fact that it really does depend on both power and connectivity, and you can end up very limited in being able to get your work done if you suddenly find that you're in the dark.
Yeah, so another thing worth remembering. And again, as the space evolves, that gains its own importance. In one of, I think it was that the Taylor something, the PDF that I hadn't quite had a chance to read, they were talking about 5G, and so how that also very interesting. Okay, how all of that space is also going to evolve, so that will impact all of this. Anything else to add around the tech and what's happening in
Only
this
that I
year?
think the pace of change is only going to get faster. So it's something we'll be talking about a lot more in 2020.
Okay. Listeners, send us your thoughts around this. How do you feel about it? I'd love to hear from people whose work is not to help people work remotely. People who are experiencing but actually need to be thinking about something else at work. But how is this affecting you? Be lovely to hear from you. So on Twitter, we are at Virtual Teamwork. So Virtual Teamwork with a 0 instead of an O. At Maya Middlemiss and at Pilar or T for our personal, or you can send us a long form message over at virtualnotdistant.com. So one other conversation that I think has exploded, is the conversation around loneliness in remote.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. And it's obviously part of a wider social trend to talk about mental health issues, which I think has also, we keep using the word exploded, but it really has been these paradigm shifts this year of how things have entered the public discourse. So we're talking about loneliness, we're talking about stress and depression and anxiety, both in and out of work in a way that we simply weren't doing a couple of years ago. So this is in parallel with that, really.
And so the Nuffield Health white paper that we were referring to earlier has some stuff around this. Not not a lot, but it's a really nice paper. It's got people like Carrie Cooper, who is very well known in the evidence-based space and in the wellbeing space. I don't know, what should we pick up? I'll have a look at the executive summary and recommendations. Talking about what we were talking. There's point 3, stress at work versus isolation at home. I love that. Stress at work versus isolation at home.
Yeah, and what happens when those boundaries are blurred by the location independent aspect of the work. And this paper also focuses a lot on the employer's responsibility as well, which is something that again is entering the debate as more and more employees enter the remote workspace who weren't really there a few years ago when it was all freelancers. So very, very interesting.
So going back to the stress at work versus isolation at home then, this is from a 2018 study, found that in Britain, young employees are particularly at risk. Again, age, with 12.5 of those in 21 to 25 age category indicating that they suffer from depression. So this is not obviously a remote, it's general, like Maya was saying, this is in context of what else is happening. And then, but they do say, of course, stress at work is common whether employees work in the office or at home. But the situation for remote workers is that other factors come into play. It's a different psychological situation. It can negatively impact resilience, the process of negotiating, managing, and adapting to significant sources of stress or trauma. Remote workers can experience isolation, lack of personal contact with colleagues, and an inability to switch off in their personal time, and then the out of sight, out of mind syndrome. However, with considerable management, along with time and effort, these problems can be met. This means recognizing that arranging remote working is not an easy option.
Indeed, and it's not easy to manage as well. I mean, this is why we do so much work with leaders of remote teams, because how do you even pick up on all of that going on for your team members when you can't see them and all you've got to go on is what they choose to communicate with you? Lots and lots of complex challenges here to unpick.
And there's also a little point on mental health, which actually starts with many managers are uncomfortable with mental health problems as they feel out of their depth and do not know how to help. So sometimes they find it easier to let matters slide. And as you're saying, if you then on top of this put how easy it is to let it slide because it's not visible and staring you in the face, then we've got an even bigger problem. So
yeah, definitely. And it needs to be part of every manager's tool set now to be able to be comfortable having these conversations. And I think it's because the public discourse has shifted so much in recent years, it's easy to forget that it is quite recent that, even that we had sort of celebrities and people talking about mental health issues, and maybe there are people in management hierarchies who simply don't have that as part of their vocabulary, and they're certainly not as part of any recent skills training.
I've emailed them to say, like I said, I've emailed them to say, why is this the case? The Nuffield Health. This is a great set of recommendations for managers and organizations about the individual and what we need to do around managing the individual, giving the individual the proper context to working, all of that. There is not one mention about teamwork. So I don't know whether it's because they haven't looked at the different kind of workers, whether they're working within a team or just in departments, whether, all of that, whether their work is affected by their colleagues and peers. There is nothing in this paper that says reevaluate how you're working as a team and adapt your communication so that it's easier for the remote people to stay involved, not feel isolated, blah, 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 blah.
Yeah, this is all about the individual and the manager of the organization, isn't it? There's nothing sideways mentioned at all.
There is nothing. They do say that some people can, because of less interactions at work, they don't know what's going on, they feel like they have to be present, blah, 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 all of that stuff. And yet they haven't gone into, okay, so what do we need to change as a team so that this doesn't happen, so that there is not inequality also of the people staying in the office. So that for me says we're still not thinking in a way that is...
We're not. And so much of what they talk about in this paper, in any normal co-located workspace, you would expect these factors to be influenced by other people, not just the manager. Everything to do with whether it's health and safety or taking breaks or switching off, and whether you're isolated or stressed. It's not just about that immediate line management relationship. It's the team and the wider organization forms so much a part of that. And it's almost, I don't know, it's almost as though this has been written without bearing that in mind, or without really understanding that the remote context follows you wherever you go. You're still part of a team.
So I think that and I had this reflection some time ago, that in the co-located space, technology is being seen as a blocker of human relationships because of the damage it can do if we decide to be communicating online with the people who are next door. Whereas in distributed companies, if we go by the practices that are shared by some of the most visible companies, like you were mentioning earlier, Maya, like people like Buffer, they really have embraced technology to ensure, or at least give that space for social connection and that social support. And I wonder sometimes whether even these kind of studies and recommendations, they're looking so much at that hybrid space, and that's coming from a very traditional point, that they're actually not going, okay, we've got these problems. How are those people where they cannot? Because some of the recommendations are actually that you go into the office and meet.
Yes, that's the only way you can connect with other people.
Yes, well, that's good. I mean, office optional, we're all about that. And I think, I would love that if I was working for an employee and I could work a lot from wherever, but also I could also go into the office. I would really welcome that. I would love that.
Yeah, it'd be great, but it would mean you could only work for an employer in the same city, or, yes, within a reasonable travel distance. So it kind of shuts down an awful lot of possibilities as well.
It does, and especially if those employers are in big cities, and there's so many issues. So how are the people who don't have offices doing it, and why isn't that practice? I mean, that's where people like us come in, where we bring this stuff that we get from Twitter, we bring it into organizations where people don't have time to go on Twitter. So, but I think there's a lot of that, and I think that's why, going back to what we were saying at the beginning of the episode, the space is moving fast, but it is really lagging. The real world is really lagging behind. So, anything else around loneliness, Maya?
Just to say again, I think this is something that we're definitely going to see as the mainstreaming continues. It's going to become more and more of an issue, particularly as we're seeing more and more people ending up in a remote or office optional situation that they didn't necessarily request or expect.
Well, if you've got this far, you are a hardcore podcast listener, so thank you so much for that. This show is now over 5 years old, and like the remote space, the podcast space has also exploded. So it means even more now that you are still with us in this episode. I'll be back very soon, maybe tomorrow, maybe next week, to share with you how Virtual Not Distant will be evolving in 2020. And that will include a new series, a new series, not a season, a new series in this very podcast with a new set of collaborators. But before I sign off this episode, I would like to wish you all the very best for 2020 in the name of all of us behind this show, so myself, Maya, and Ross. And I'm also inviting you to get in touch with your big questions for 2020, because I'm preparing an episode, probably titled Big Questions with No Answers. And it would be great to have a wide range of questions, but also to see which are the ones in our collective subconscious. So you can send me a message through virtualnotdistant.com. You can email me, Pilar, Pilar, at virtualnotdistant.com. Or you can also send me a tweet at Pilar Orti and I will grab it. So I look forward to hearing from you. And for now, thank you for listening. A big thank you for listening to the 21st Century Work-Life podcast produced by Virtual Not Distant. If you have something to add to the conversation, let us know through the contact form over at virtualnotdistant.com. I have been your host, Pilar Orti, and I'm signing off now. Wherever you are, whatever you're doing, enjoy.